Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I know today is Friday afternoon, so I hope you're not tired, not yet, and still interested fluid mud. I hope. My name is Diego, he's Caio, and also we prepared this presentation with the collaboration of Luana, who is over there. And so we're gonna explain you a little bit about the things we have been doing in our lab concerning this subject. Really close to what Alex, Yoris, and the other presenters told you. So now we are more interested in characterization, step number 1, that Alex has just presented to you, and step number 2, monitoring. So, as you all know, we have this nautical water concept. So here we're not gonna repeat this concept, but the important thing for us is that there is a critical limit, and this critical limit is associated to rheological transition. And this rheological transition in terms of viscosity, yield stress, or whatever rheological properties. And as everybody said, we have difficulties to measure rheological properties in situ in a standard, accurate way. And, well, the most adapted procedure is to correlate the rheological properties with other properties like density. And for this correlation, we need rheological tests in the lab. So we take the samples, we move to the lab, assess them in the lab, with a rheometer. Here an example of the rheometer we have in our lab. So the advantage of rheological characterizations with the rheometer is that it's an accurate method. We can assess several parameters, rheological parameters, yield stress, viscosity, many things. But the problem is that there's still no standard about these tests. And different protocols, methods, rheological methods to obtain yield stress, viscosity may lead to different, really different results. So it's complicated if you want to compare different regions, different ports. And this, as everybody said, we're more interested not in the rheology of fluid mud, but the effect, its effect on vessels, for example. And so we need standards to measure and to be able to compare all the results and correlate all these different methods to assess rheological properties and the methods. And in situ, we need methods, but for easily determining these properties. As you saw, it's a quite complicated approach. So we go acoustic methods and density profiles, and then you grab samples, you move to laboratory, you perform rheological tests, you calibrate your density profiles. For example, if you use ReaTune, and then you assess rheology, you go back to density profiles, you change the end for yield stress profiles. It's quite complicated. Well, hello? Where? And you need to simplify and shorten this approach. So the traditional approach, well, here we have many things before this. So the acoustic surveys identify the zones of presence of fluid mud, and then laboratory tests, rheological tests, and then the rheological assessment of the correlation between density and yield stress to be able to see this profile as a rheological profile. So being more interested now at this part, the characterization, the rheological characterization, we have been working with several samples in our lab, but for today, basically from 3 of the main ports in Brazil, Port of Itajaí, Port of Rio Grande, both in the south of Brazil, and Port of São Paulo in the southeast, Port of São Paulo, Port of Santos, sorry. And also with the Amazon, south and north bars of the Amazon. It's an important route for navigation. And here, talking about grain size before rheology. Here, for the Amazon first, we can see that we have all of those samples over there. All of those samples over there. And then you can see, because we have samples from 2006 until 4 years ago. So you have many samples for different locations along this region. So you can see that here you have a transition zone between sand and mud. So here you have only sand, and here you have sand and mud with huge variations. So really a transition zone depending on the year, the tide condition, the flow conditions. And then you have here, around this point here, which is something here, you have a mud zone, a constant mud zone with almost no sand here. And then it keeps going. And I have really, when you have the mean values for everything here, you have these values here. So basically silt. Well, comparing the samples from the Amazon, from Itajaí and Port of Santos, we have also mainly silt and clay with low sand content. So they are really mud samples here. And when you put them here, we can see that they are typically of a highly energetic environment and mainly silt and mud, so many mud. Oops, sorry. And now Kyle is gonna present you some results about Atterberg and bryology.
So, moving on with the mud characterization, we have the Atterberg limits. The Atterberg limits is a technique to measure the critical water content in a soil. It's independent of the density, and it's a standardized method to describe. So depending on the water content in a soil, it may appear in 4 states: the solid state, semi-solid state, plastic state, and liquid state. Using a set of tools and devices, we can reach the plastic limit, above which the soil enters in a plastic state, and the liquid limit, when the soil enters in a liquid state. So the difference between them, it's the plasticity index. We are going to use this forward. So then we did the rheological tests using a rheometer. Instead of the Atterberg limits, the flow properties, for example, yield stress, depend on the density. We used several samples in about 7 densities each. We adopted the clays and collaborators protocol to assess the equilibrium flow curves. Some details of our tests. We use a vein spindle, a shear rate controlled, and this is the shear rate, the range of the shear rate we used. So, some results. Here is the plasticity chart, where the plasticity index in function of the liquid limit. Here we have in blue the Amazon North Bar, in green the Port of Itajaí, and in red the Port of Santos. Here we can see that Amazon North Bar samples are less plastic than Port of Itajaí, followed by Port of Santos. So we can expect lower yield stresses in the Amazon samples than the other samples. Here it's our results for rheology, Bingham yield stress versus density. You can realize that this behavior was expected by the plasticity chart. We have higher yield stress for samples for Port of Santos samples than Itajaí and then Amazon samples. It was the behavior we expected from this previous chart. So in Amazon North Bar, it's homogeneous, but we can see 2 different groups. It's a variation of the Bingham stress, but it's not a great variation. It's about 35 Pascal. And in the Port of Santos, we cannot string any specific group, and the variation of the Bingham stress was about 1,000, very heterogeneous. Here we have a chart, Bingham stress versus the plasticity index. Bingham stress from the rheometer and the plasticity index from Atterberg limits. So we can correlate both parameters for the samples, and we can see there is a good fit in the trend. They are all samples in 5 densities, and it's a good fit on trend. So we have the plasticity index again. Now it's versus the clay content. So here we have the trends of clays, different kinds of clays, and the slope of this trend is the activity index. So we have different activity index for each clay, and here we have Amazon channel in this blue, and the Santos channel, in Itajaí channel, they are in the same place on the chart. So we can realize that Santos channel and Itajaí channel the clay are more active than the Amazon channel clays.
So, what we can conclude about all these results here, we can see that the samples are really different. The regions, between regions, and even in the same region as Santos, for example, they are really different. But if you want to discuss about this critical density, only considering a real logical point of view, if you remember the table that many of the presenters showed you about different ports in the world, we can zoom here, and then if you consider the point where this trend changes, I mean this point here, when it changed from a right trend to exponential increase, we can estimate considering also well, I can say a safer parameter. So using in this really heterogeneous group the samples with the highest yield stress, we can assume 1150 density, a critical density in the rheological point of view. But for Itajaí, also using the highest yield stress samples. Here you have more samples because I have already tested many samples from Itajaí, but concerning the Atterberg limits, we only tested 5 samples. That's the reason why we had only 5 green dots before and many green dots here. But if you see for the Amazon, for example, you have densities around 1300. And just for example, after the workshop, or even now, if you want to see, here we have a sample at 1200 of density for the Amazon. And you can see it's really liquid. And we prepared this some months ago, like 5-6 months ago. So maybe it's even higher than 1200. And it's still liquid. It flows easily. And here, even though, if you consider this behavior, we can see that in terms of yield stress, we are still in a really safe zone. Around, I don't know, maybe 30, 40, something like this here. So it's really a safer zone, a safe zone, so we can even figure out about increasing these values. So going back to the approach I showed you, now interested about this part here, this first part. We use the density tune, so it's quite the same of the real tune. The software changed, but it's the same enterprise, it's the same equipment. We use the density tune for field measurements, and we have problems because we have density profiles, so we are not able to say about the rheological behavior. So you need to go to the rheometer and then assess the critical density, establish a critical density, and then go back here. And it takes time because we need to use a model, protocol, have an equipment like this. It's a little bit expensive. You need to have like specialized people to operate this equipment. So it takes time because you need to dilute the sample into several densities. So what's the tuning fork, the density tune or whatever? It's a heavy drop probe with depth sensor here and a tuning fork on its far end. And well, it measures amplitude and frequency data, and it has an internal algorithm for transforming it into density values. But for doing this transformation, it requires calibration, which is site-specific. So it depends on the local composition of the mud, this transformation from amplitude frequency into density values. So the problems. This is an unknown method. The equipment does it by itself, so we don't know what the equipment is doing. So it's a problem for research purpose and for improving this algorithm. So in a previous study, we tried to propose another algorithm for establishing this transformation, and we succeed. So the density profiles, the edited ones, they are really close. And the question we did this was because of this. Because if the calibration is site-dependent, so it means it depends on the rheology for calibrating frequency amplitude into density. So maybe with this calibration procedure, we are able to estimate rheology through the calibration procedure. So these are examples of a calibration domain of frequency here on the bottom and amplitude here, and the colors represent different densities. Pay attention that the scale bars are really different because the samples, they behave really different in a different way. So here yellow means 1500, while here for Santos yellow means 1350. But as we can expect, it's a shape for viscoelastic suspension. It means for lower densities, the shape tends to a point. It means it tends to water, so a Newtonian fluid. So it gets narrower. And for higher densities, the shape gets wider because you have a more viscoelastic behavior, so the shape gets spread. And also, if the shape gets wider on the bottom for higher densities, it means that for lower amplitudes, you have higher viscosities. Because higher the density, higher the viscosity. So considering this, so lower amplitudes, higher viscosities, we have examples of many samples we tested with the density tuned calibration. So for example, if we assume 1 volt as a parameter, as a parameter, we can estimate that for Santos, in 1 volt, it has 1300 kilograms per cubic meter of density, while for Rio Grande, a little bit more, even more for Itajaí, and much more for Amazon. So we can assume that if it has a same viscosity in a higher density, it means that for a given density, the yield stress of Santos will be higher than that one from Rio Grande, then higher than Itajaí, and then higher from the Amazon. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and surprisingly, it's exactly what we found in the rheometer. When we took the same samples of the calibration of the density tune, and we tested those same samples with the rheometer, the protocol Caio mentioned, which is, by the way, the same that Yoris presented. So it was proposed at the last Interco conference. We have the same trend. So for a given density, we have Santos, and then Rio Grande, and then Itajaí, and then the Amazon in terms of yield stress decreasing. So it's really in agreement. So figuring this out, we're trying to first to shorten the procedure, the 3 slides with the density profiles, the rheometer, rheological assessment. So we propose establish a relation between this viscous amplitude, so the values we showed in the nice colorful pictures before, with the Bingham yield stress. It's a quite good correlation. So with this correlation, using only Itajaí and Amazon samples, because we had many samples from Itajaí and from the other locations, so we use just samples from Itajaí and Amazon here for this correlation. And then we put this correlation with Rio Grande samples to try to validate the approach. And here we can see the density profile in terms of depth. So you have a first Lutoc line here, and then deeper the density rises again. And the same trend we observe here with the density profile calculating the yield stress through the equation we obtained with the rheometer. So we took the samples from Rio Grande, we tested them with the rheometer, we obtained the curve relating density and yield stress. And this is the curve here in red. And then we also took this curve here, and then we calculated the yield stress. You can see that the trend is the same, only the values, because, well, as you can observe here, the values are really, really high. They have no sense for navigation purpose. So here is just in terms of model, I cut the values with this trend here. So as you can see here, there are no data for really low densities and really high densities. So that's why it's suddenly cut. So here, as I don't remember who mentioned this, but as you can see here, for the first photocline, there's no change in the yield stress. So it doesn't mean a restriction for navigation, but probably the high frequency echo sounder will see this. But it means that it has no restriction for navigation, for example. And we have this restriction maybe 1 meter below. So the idea now basically is to shorten a little bit the procedure. So if we are able to use the same curve for all the samples, we can short this way. So we have our density profiles, and once we calibrate the densitometer in the lab, we don't need to dilute, take the samples and send them to the rheometer tests. We can also have the rheological curve of the sample without using a rheometer anymore. So it helps us keeping the same protocol, the same standards with all the samples. And also, well, this is a good result, but the best one is that with this initial knowledge about the calibration procedure and now about the linking between rheology and calibration, we are trying to figure out about how to do this in situ. Because now, before we needed rheological tests, now during the calibration we have rheological profiles, but we need the calibration procedure to assess this. And now we are trying to figure out about how to have in situ not only density profiles, but exploring more the frequency and amplitude change. This is a profile for Santos. Well, if I'm not wrong, they are for Santos, for example. But just as an example, how to use them to estimate in situ rheological depths, for example. So, as conclusions, as Caio showed you, we have great difference in fluid mud rheology when we compare different regions. So this density criteria is not universal. As you saw in the table, the values were quite close from 1150 until 1250, but sometimes they can be really high, as I showed you for the Amazon, for example, even above 1300. So this is important. The similar patterns and correlations. So the atebag limits he showed you, it's a standardized procedure, and it's really easy. It's really, really cheap to buy the equipment. It's a really simple procedure, standardized, so they can have a really good correlation with more sophisticated tests. So, for example, inside a boat, if you have an oven, you can perform the atebag limits, for example, in a long campaign. Now I'm not talking about a port for sure, but in a distant region, for example, as we do in the Amazon, for example, where we stay several days. But we need to understand more the reasons for these differences. Now we are just addressing the differences we observed, and now our second step is to analyze which parameters produce these differences we showed. And for the tuning fork, the shape of the calibration domain is indeed related to the rheology of the mud. And so there is a really great opportunity for improving the survey approach, shorten it. But the last message, well, I can say the most important is that this nautical bottom criterion that all of us have been saying, it depends on in situ surveys, of course, bottom parameters, as we showed here, but it also depends on ship parameters, environmental conditions, port conditions, and pilot's training. So I can say that among the steps Alex presents you, the fourth one, the stakeholders management, so like pilots training, assessing the port conditions and everything here. It's a really important part of this nautical bottom. So with not taking this into account, it will not succeed as a different approach. So I would like to thank you for your attention, especially on Friday afternoon. So if you have any question, don't hesitate.
Seek pilot. Very ingenious approach, I think. It's congratulations for the creativity on it. But you have already a paper published for this. I mean, it was already criticized by the academy.
So do we have a paper, Diego?
Yeah, we have a paper about. We have several papers, but concerning the rheological, several papers about this fluid mud. I mean, of course, but about rheology of fluid mud, we published a paper only with the results for the samples from Santos. And what you observe, unfortunately, is that by the time of the paper, we had only tested some samples, and we had observed a consistent trend, for increasing yield stresses towards the port, the inner portions of the port. But now, what we observed, I don't know if you remember, but the results for Santos were quite problematic. I mean, because they were really spread. And maybe it means that, well, first we thought about, oh, maybe our tests are not good. We need to repeat the test with the rheometer. But we observed the same pattern for the afterbag limits. So we thought, well, maybe we need to repeat afterbag limits, and then we observed consistently for everything we did, also for the calibration domains with the tuning fork. So we know that it is indeed behavior of the place, of the region. What is causing this? We still don't know, but we imagine that it's a really anthropocized, I don't know how to say this, anthropic place with a huge activity, dredging activity, maintenance, sewage, industries, so organic matter, metals. So maybe the samples, they are not representative from the place, but only from the spot they were removed. So we took samples with a great amount of metals, maybe, and if we go there tomorrow, we will take another thing. Maybe it's this.
Well, the good news is we are having a track with new samples from Santos, so you can can check your a track. Yes, I think so. No, just to scare them. There's some samples, some more samples for them, but. Yoris.
Yeah, very impressive work, I think. If I understand correctly, then you so basically you kind of reverse engineered the density algorithm, ish. And I think then what you're trying to do is linking the calibration curve of the density to the rheological properties, right? Do you have any idea whether that corresponds to the way that the RealTune software works?
Yeah, I imagine we have the RealTune also. Now we are still not working with RealTune, only DensiTune, because we took a look at RealTune, but we were a little bit not comfortable about not understanding what was happening there. So in order to improve the data, because we're not interested in a reverse engineering in order to produce a DensiTune. We are more interested in reverse engineering in order to be able to understand the mathematical link between the parameters. So we are not agreeing with this blind procedure. So that's why we are considering using RealTune in the next month, for example, like using the data, but we didn't use for this reason, because we're more trying to figure out how it works before using it.
And then maybe one small comment is that at a certain point you showed two vertical profiles where you showed that for a certain sample there was you saw a densimetric jump, so a loop decline, but you didn't see any yield stress occurring. It's for that depth. It's something that we also saw in Zeebrugge, that at a certain depth you didn't have a yield stress yet, but the density already starts to increase. But then you made the claim that this means that this has no implications for nautical accessibility.
Yeah.
But I think you have to be careful there, because just the fact that you have a loop decline can mean that you get an internal wave, and that can have. Remember the movie?
Yeah. Sorry about that. I was talking about in terms of rheology, but yeah, of course it depends on the parameters related to the port, the ships, and these internal waves. They will depend also on this movement. So I was just saying in terms of rheology, but you are right. This density change may, of course, change the maneuverability of the vessel. So, nobody else?
So, no more questions. So, thank Diego and Caio again.